Welcome to another Unwinding with Fiber and Fabric and Tour de Fleece 2023. We are off to a better start than we were yesterday. I actually remembered the correct year. We are well past the first week of the Tour de Fleece this year, and routines are starting to set in for many of us. Fatigue may be setting in for many of us. Many of us may be looking towards a rest day, which of course, in our own individual challenges, we can take them as we need them. But the official rest day is coming up. and many like me may be thinking, that's going to be a really nice day to rest. I have been getting up quite early to record these videos when it's quiet, and quiet minus the cats. And it's developed a bit of a routine that the cats seem to think I need to follow. This morning, I decided I was going to sleep in. I was going to sleep in, record a little bit later. It was all going to be fine. But the cats were very confused. No one was awake. And they had to come and wake me up. But I am going to show a photo right here of what they did as soon as I was awake and in the office getting ready for the day. Living with cats, crafting with cats, the routine has set in for them. I hope we can break the routine when Tour de Fleece is over, and maybe, just maybe, I might be able to sleep in again. All right, let's find out what the topic is today. Dyeing fiber, adding color. I love this topic. It is definitely one of my favorite things to do with my fiber and my hand spun. So it'll be a nice one to talk about, especially as I am continuing to spin this Targhee Debouillé crossed fleece that has been blended with silk and white alpaca. I continued to spin on it yesterday after I recorded the video, and I have, I think, just over half of it spun. So let's dive into the discussion of color. It's funny, I was commenting with someone the other day about spinning what looks like the never-ending spin during an event like Tour de Fleece. When we spin something like a white, for some reason it feels like it never ends. There's no progress being made. Sometimes we really do continue to watch the bob and fill, but it doesn't look like it's filling to us, mainly because it's just the matte white. That's why during events like this, I like to spin a colored, dyed, especially a multicolored dyed fiber. It just changes things up a little bit. It makes the photographs, at least if nothing else, that we take and share look different every day. But when you have a pretty white fleece, it is nice to occasionally spin it up and then add the dyes afterwards. My preference most of the time, though, is to dye the unspun fiber. And there's a reason that I prefer this. Even in my quilting world, I gravitate to textiles that may, from a distance, read as a solid color. But when you get up close, you see lots of nuanced colors, lots of different variations to the color that it is reading. And I have found that with spinning, it carries over this concept of having many different colors come together to create the overall finished color effect. So I'm going to talk about the different dyes and different fibers that we can dye, But one of the first things I want to mention is when I first started dyeing my own fiber, I tried dyeing it in a much more raw, unprocessed state. If you're dyeing a wool that has lanolin in it, the lanolin can interfere with the absorption of the dye. And you can get a lot more bleeding effects afterwards. It just doesn't, well, the lanolin acts as a resist. It is a waxy substance, and much like people who make boutique fabrics, it is a resist to the color. So when you're trying to dye a fiber, a clean fiber is going to give you more success. I think I'm going to need to put some oil on this wheel, the leathers on this wheel today. All right, so a clean fiber is definitely going to take your dyes better. But when you have a minimally processed fiber, when you are dyeing the fiber and there's still lock definition, there is, you know, in short, you're not, it's not open and fluffy fiber. The natural lock definition or clumping that it will look like will actually act as a bit of a resist as well. And it can create quite the dye project. Because much like when we do a tie-dye or a scrunched up version of a tie-dyed shirt, you're going to have areas that take color more intensely than others. And when you say take a batch of locks and you put color on it and you get that dye to set, and then you rinse it and you dry it, and then you sit down to spin it, the different variations of color start to come through, and you get that overall effect of a solid color from a distance, but with lots of different shading when you look closely at it. And to me, it is a much more rich and vibrant and luscious final product, because that's what you've done. You've created many shades of color rather than just one solid color. Now there are times when people want just a solid color, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if you're interested in trying dyeing your own fiber, consider trying that as well. So if you want to have an overall solid color, you need to have your fiber open and fluffy so that all of its surface area can take the dye relatively evenly in the process. So that's how I like to play with my dyes. Of course, you can dye the finished yarn, and you can, and when working with certain certain fibers, that might be more preferable because you have a more stable, less easily felted product. But not all fibers are going to use the same dyes, and not all fibers are going to react the same to the dyes that we use. So let's go ahead and start with the easy fiber. The protein fibers, the animal fibers, the protein fibers, silk, your wools, these fibers really want to take on dye. They're receptive to it. They do not need a mordant. Let's just clarify some terminology. A mordant is what is used to have a chemical reaction to make a dye, a certain dyes attached to the fiber. When it comes to dyeing our protein fibers, we do not need a mordant. We use what is called a fixative. Now, it may seem a little pedantic. Now I can't say the word. It's still too early. It may seem I'm being a little too technical in this, but I do know there are some reasons why you want to use fixative when you're talking about using acid dyes on your protein fibers, okay, rather than a mordant. The minute you start talking about mordants, there are some other safety concern in many cases that you need to consider. So as someone who is taking on dyeing as a new person, I really recommend that you try to use that terminology, different terminology, because it does, it will kind of help have you avoid maybe some of the pitfalls, because the minute we start talking about mordants, we need to start taking care and making sure that the mordants we're using are safe, okay? Because a lot of the traditional ones can actually have greater harm to the body than a lot of the modern dyes, and certainly the acid dyes. And when we say acid dyes, it's using citric acid, vinegar, lemon juice, citric acid powder, citric acid, the thing that we drink in many of our flavored drinks. It's using that as a fixative to set that dye into the protein fiber. So when using wool, when using protein fibers, silk and wool, you can use an acid dye. And a lot of new dyers, people wanting to dabble, a lot of them will get fruit drinks, Kool-Aid as the big one, but your fruit drinks, the non-sugar variation, not the sugar-free, no, the unsweetened powder of basically food dye and citric acid. And so you want to get, if you want to play, and I know there's a lot of debate as to how color fast food dyes are compared to commercially prepared acid dyes. But if you're dabbling, you're not trying to create an heirloom that's going to be around for hundreds of years, etc. And Kool-Aid is a very fun way to to play with color. My personal favorite is black cherry. The black cherry Kool-Aid put on top of colored fleece can just be wonderful. And the added advantage to dyeing with Kool-Aid is that sometimes your fiber ends up having a lingering smell of whatever flavor Kool-Aid you used. And so black cherry was one of my favorites when I started playing with fiber, spinning fiber, wool, and dyes. Now, with that being said, not all protein fibers take dye the same way. Silk is going to take on the dye and have such a intensity. It is, now, with that being said, a lot of times silk still has some of the, I believe the pronunciation is Saracen, on it, a coating. And so it's good to soak the fiber, and it's actually not a bad thing with any of them. Soak the fiber in citric acid water solution ahead of time. It helps remove some of any of the coatings, and it also preps the fiber to really take the color as soon as you add the color. So Kool-Aid, is good. Acid dyes are better. There are a number of companies that sell acid dyes here in the United States. Two of the big ones, one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast. The East Coast is Pro Chemical and Dye, and the West Coast is Dharma Trading Company. There are smaller smaller stores and outlets in different areas who will sell you dyes as well. Both of the companies that I have mentioned will sell the acid dyes that you want in a whole arrangement of color, and they'll also sell the fiber reactive dyes that you need when you move away from protein fibers and you move into plant fibers, the cellulose fibers. And so fiber reactive dyes, though, they are different than the acid dyes. Acid dyes and protein fibers, it's really simple. Hot water, okay, and the dye companies will provide lots of instructions. That's the other reason I really like Pro Chemical and Dye and Dharma Trading, is both of them have really good instruction sheets. My favorite is actually the instruction sheets that come with Pro Chemical and Dye. They have a bunch of download PDFs that you can get that walk you through the many different ways of dyeing fibers or fabrics with their dyes. So it's a great resource as well, because it talks you through quantities, weights. But basically for the protein fibers, it is hot water, dye, and citric acid, and then time for it to absorb. So I've talked about dyeing process in other videos. There's a lot of people out there who like putting together informative information, and it's something to look into. Fiber reactive dyes, though, they require a reactive agent. And in this case, it is sodium carbonate. And sodium carbonate is, while not extraordinarily harmful, it is not something that coming in contact any length of time with hands, skin, hair, it can have a very harsh effect. Sodium carbonate is like, it's not the same as baking soda. Baking soda is sodium bicarbonate, but it's used a lot of times as washing soda, as in laundry soap. So, and yes, it is something that if you get it, if you get it on your hands and stuff just a little bit, you're going to be fine, just like, laundry soap. But it is rough, it is caustic, it is going to strip your hands a bit of its natural moistures. And it's not necessarily the best thing for our delicate protein fibers that we're spinning, but it is fabulous when we're doing cellulose fibers. So the wonderful thing about it is it doesn't require the same kind of process. Now, when I do tie-dyeing shirts, what I've discovered is that the fiber reactive process does require keeping it at a certain temperature, in essence above 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and the time that, the length of time that we allow it to sit can vary in how the color sets. But usually when I'm doing my fibers, my spinning fibers, I am doing what we call the immersion process rather than the tie-dye process. But there are instruction sheets that come with the dyes. I will mention, when you dye roving, when you dye bats, and I or your unprocessed clean fiber, the dyeing process is going to take the air, the fluffiness out of your fiber. So that's one of the reasons I like to dye my fiber before processing it into roll-logs or bats, is that it takes the air out of it. When you dye a braid of roving, it's not going to look as fluffy. It's going to look a little bit like maybe it's been felted. Not to worry, as long as you are handling it properly, it should be fine. But you will have to fluff it up. In order to get it to look fluffy again, you have to fluff it up. And somebody mentioned a tip that they saw somebody do by taking a steam clothing steamer, okay, and a burst of steam can help fluff it up as well. So something to keep in mind is that your fibers are going to look compressed because the process of dyeing them and getting them wet and everything, they're going to kind of just want to stick together. And so fluffing them up afterwards will help help with the spinning process, help it, you know, again, draft nicely. So what the common dyes, modern dyes of today that are used are the acid dyes for the protein fibers and the fiber reactive dyes for the cellulose fibers. Now, an interesting note on this, nylon, which is a man-made product, it will actually work with acid dyes. So when you have your sock yarn that comes with nylon in it for strength, or your braid of fiber that came with some nylon blended in for strength, that nylon's going to take the dye as the rest of the fiber does. However, when you get to the plant-based fibers, like rayon, you need to have the fiber reactive dyes that work for cotton. So when you're looking into dyes, that's the thing to keep in mind. The companies should tell you what kind of fibers, but plant-based, one type, protein-based, another type. Now, it would be remiss of me to not talk about natural dyes, because there are people who want to do natural dyes, and this is going to be my big caveat. If you want to use natural dyes, anything from taking a bunch of onion skins and boiling those and using those to dye your wool, to other plants that you may look into. My caveat: do not scrimp on your research. Research natural dyes. There are some good resources out there. Do your homework, because again, using natural dyes, unlike the man-made chemical dyes that have made it to where we can just use either citric acid or soda ash, is, the sodium carbonate, soda ash, okay? The modern dyes allow us to use very simple, easy to source fixatives and fiber and reactive substances to create the bond between the fiber and the dye. When we're dealing with natural dyes, and I should say, when you run into what is the health, that's going to be the big question before I even get into the natural dyes. When we look at fiber reactive dyes and we look at acid dyes, most companies, at least here in the United States, have to have, sheets that tell you what their health hazards, etc. But these dyes, especially Kool-Aid, which we drink, these dyes, their main concern why they suggest you wear masks or ventilators is not once the dye is turned into a liquid. It is the powder. We are dealing with micron powders that we shouldn't be inhaling. So once the dye is mixed up, these dyes are safe. And yes, you want to put on gloves, whether it's working with Kool-Aid or commercially made acid dyes, or the fiber reactive dyes doing tie-dyes and cottons and things like that. Wear gloves. Wear gloves, wear aprons. You don't want the stains, okay? But their main health warning is you do not want to breathe in the powders. It's as simple as that, okay? Now, when we get into natural dyes require different mordants. And these mordants can be things from copper to iron. Quite an alum is used. And some of them are relatively safe and we come in contact with them on a daily basis, and others not so much. So if you're getting into natural dyes and you want your natural dyeing process to be successful, do your homework. There is less wing it and just do it as you go, as you will find in the other dyes that we have available today. Now, the other thing I'm going to mention, and this can affect even this can affect using your acid dyes and using your fiber reactive dyes. Your water, your tap water, can be an issue. I lived in an area in Colorado in which we had a huge, very, very high iron content in the water. And I didn't take note of it as I was using some natural dyes. I was using I can't pronounce things, cochineal, this, the red dye that you get from little tiny insects that grow on cactus. I was using that cochineal dye on some fiber, and it's supposed to give a vibrant, beautiful red, but the iron in my water turned it fuchsia. So when you're working with natural dyes, minerals in your water can affect the overall color. Again, minerals, iron, can be a mordant. It's going to affect the color. So when you're working with natural dyes, and if that's what you want to get into, by all means, there's some wonderful natural dyes. There's some different things out there to use. I've even used what a company called Earth Minerals, that basically it's very finely ground up dirt, and we used pureed soybean liquid as a bonding agent to basically create a paint that sits on top of the fiber. It doesn't go in and absorb into the molecules of the fiber like a dye does, but it sits on top. And that was a lot of fun. If you're wanting to look into doing natural dyes, do so. But do so, in this case, do so with less of a wing it and more of a research and homework done. Because you can grow your own plants and you can dye your own fiber, and it's wonderful, but be safe. And again, onion skins, just, it's amazing. Just keep, your onion skins for a while, collect them, boil them down, and do that. And I've done walnut husks. But again, all of these things that we're using, they are chemicals. And we need to understand what they do, how they affect us, and we need to be safe. And that's why I tend to stick with the commercially prepared dyes, because my results are more consistent, and they've done the research to tell me the safety issues. Letting them do the homework rather than me do the homework. So I think I've covered everything. I love talking about, one last, acrylic does not take dye. So if you want to have something that you put in your fiber that will stay a color, acrylic is the thing. It's not going to take the dye. So I love dyeing fiber. I love dyeing my own fiber. It is something I do enjoy. I have had fun dabbling with and taken a couple classes on using some of the natural dyes. It's just a lot of fun. So I hope that you have enjoyed this Unwinding with Fiber and Fabric and another day of Tour de Fleece 2023. Take care of yourself. Get some rest. Get up, move around. If it's nice weather, breathe in some nice weather. I will see you tomorrow. Until then, happy spinning.